Hi, good morning, everybody. So thank you. So I'm James Toon. I'm a product manager working for the Pure team, and I will be presenting today along with Gavin. Gavin is our chief analyst from the research fish team, Elsevier, and I think we're probably going to win the we're not going to win the prize for the snappiest title of presentation so far. So we wanted to do a presentation today, which is a sort of culmination of a number of years worth of project work that Gavin and I have been working on, looking at how the relationship between individual institutional impact recording and funder level institutional reporting is kind of put together. In terms of what we're going to cover today, really going to be split into two kind of broad sections, the first of which obviously introducing what we've been doing, and the second part is for me to hand over to Gavin to talk through the more funder level perspectives of research information recording. So let's get through that one. So what does this project look like, and what have we been doing? So it's been about 3 or 4 years now, I think, Gavin, that we've been doing this. Our initial kind of phase of this project was looking at the nature of outcome scope. Initially, the project we kind of put together where we did a poster, which was actually at the EAMA conference a few years back, was looking at how the knowledge exchange activity recorded in systems like Pure correlated to impact as identified by funders. And the idea behind this was obviously to try and sort of seek which content types were most useful in the context of funder-led impact management work. We then started to look at the cross-institutional collaboration that existed when we're looking at how funders interpreted impact versus how institutions individually interpreted impact. And then our last part really is kind of related to this presentation, is how we can then sort of make use of this information to understand a more comprehensive evaluation of impact, to be able to kind of the most valuable information to those that need it. So what is the overall importance of research impact? So it's become very much a kind of mission critical kind of feature for research funding organizations over in recent years. Demonstrating impact value, investment value rather, obviously fairly significant. So looking at the reach of funding and investments overall to see whether or not that money was essentially kind of good, well spent. Using information about impacts to help guide strategies. So, for example, how to look at data and outcomes and how to understand and refine how to then retarget new funding efforts going forward into new rounds and so forth. And then also just to kind of maintain a kind of clear view on performance and to make sure we understand accountability and effectiveness of research funding as awarded to institutions. And we did a bit of analysis on some funder information and came up with a few examples really of how this is kind of looked at. So for example, we have a funder here who's looking at capacity evaluation on a capacity building scheme, looking at the actual impact gathered over time from institutions fed into that, and I realized actually that the capacity scheme wasn't working, and it used the information to be able to then sort of redefine and reevaluate the impact of changes on this one. Our second funder had multiple mechanisms in place to look at early career researchers and then using this data gathered from institutions, how to change the efficiency of their schemes and their management processes around there. And then thirdly, a funder who was looking at how kind of funding was used to improve the speed of translating research into actual kind of products. And how this basically kind of managed over a longer period of time was then very useful for how they could then inform their other kind of forward mechanisms. And we put in place these examples because I think it's easy when we're collecting impact to do so on a very kind of local level and not necessarily look at the actual ultimate goal. And in particular for gathering information for researchers, they have a clear need to understand the why it is important for them to be able to do this. So obviously in terms of the sort of the relationship between these kind of funding drivers and institutions, so funding mechanisms have evolved, obviously. So the drivers now for research organizations to support, particularly in the UK, have also evolved to be able to kind of support these processes. So we have an annual collection exercise for the major UK funders, which is managed through the Research Fish product. And that exercise obviously kind of is very, very geared towards a particular kind of set of requirements within there. Interestingly, though, what we do see is that institutions very, very heavily focus, and unsurprisingly so, on their own organizations, their current employees, and their own research outputs when they're actually making these submissions into the process. We also see some slightly kind of conflicting perspectives. So, for example, whilst the funders have very specific drivers in terms of how they manage research impact, the research assessment exercises in the UK for the dual funding kind of streams, the UK REF as is known, that also drives a slightly alternative kind of route to capturing information around impact. So with those slightly conflicting drivers and more focused kind of individual needs, a lot of institutions, of course, are using Pure to help record this information. I think it's just from a point of view of emphasizing on here, Pure already comes with an impact content type. It's available already in Pure Core. It's not an additional module. You can turn it on. You can make use of it at any time. It comes in multiple different modes. There's a standard mode and an extended mode, which lets you also gather and capture more specific evidencing that specifically relates to impacts within there. So on that, I'm going to hand over now to Gavin to talk you through a little bit on the funder side.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. And I can use the clicker. That's always good. And so talking about the funder's perspective on research impact. So from an institutional perspective, as James has laid out, there's a very particular focus on what happens at the institution. It's the C in CRIS. It's the current research at the institution. Funders do have a different perspective. So the first one example here you can see is that actually, not always, but very often with funding can involve multiple researchers at multiple organizations, can also involve private sector companies, foundations, and actually there's activity going on in all of those locations, in all of those places. And so one institution isn't necessarily going to capture the full scope of it. They'll just get what's going on at their own institution. So the funder has this initial view that gives them a much more holistic understanding about all the different areas that the activities are going on and where the impact is going to be generated from. The other is, just by its very nature, impact can take a long time. And so it might take 20 years for a particular big ticket piece of impact to happen. And over that time, everybody's going to move. And so if you're looking at something that's current and at a single institution, you're not necessarily going to be able to capture that full scope if people have moved around over that time period. So from the funder's perspective, they can have that bigger view. But even from those individual funders, reality is more complicated still, because it's rare that impact would arise from a single strand of funding from a single funder. And actually, there are multiple funding sources contributing to these activities over time. And so the connection between the funders and all of these makes this even more complicated. And as James said, many funders use ResearchFish to try and help with that, because the way that ResearchFish is set up, it's a federated model, so all of these different connections can be represented. And so you can understand this over a longer time period, but you still need to know what's going on and set it up in the right kind of a way. So next, we've got some diagrams. James was a little bit concerned about the diagrams, so we'll hopefully try and spell out some examples that try and make this a little bit more concrete. So the first example here is of cross-institutional research. So there is a project that's going on, the funder is funding, and it's two different researchers at two different research organizations. And so the funder sits in the middle and kind of has this perspective across both institutions, but you would imagine that those two institutions would have a good sense as to what's going on in each other. They might be people that went in on the grant originally. They've got a good sense of what's going on, but even within those individual repositories, they're likely only capturing information related to their own PI and not the project as a whole. The next example is one of institutional movement over time. And so here you can see the funder has funded a researcher at the first research organization at time 1. And then time 2, which may be a few years later, the project continues with a researcher at a different institution. And so unlike in the first example, there is no actual formal connection between the research organizations. It's just people have moved. And so each of those organizations will have a time-based snippet of the activity that relates to that project that is ultimately going to lead to the impact. And so with just that snippet, they're not going to really be able to understand everything that's going on there. And then finally, and this is the one that broke Gems, this is probably closer to reality, which is obviously much more complicated. So here we have 3 times, and you'll see in the first time, hopefully, funder 1 and funder 2 are both funding work that takes place at the first and second row, and are supporting PI 1 and PI 2. And then over time, we go to time 2, funder 1 and funder 2 are still involved. Row 2 has dropped out. We've got a new PI involved, and we've got a new funder involved. So this time we've got lots of people funding lots of activity only taking place in row 1. And then the next time phase, could be a few years later, row 4 and row 3 are now involved because PI 2 has moved, the work has moved with them, and PI 4 is now involved. And so if you were row 1, row 2, funder 1, funder 2, you wouldn't have that final perspective where the big impact is playing out unless you understood this picture where everything's combined together. And so that's just an example of, this is probably closer to the real world. It's even more complicated than this, but we couldn't get the diagram to fit. And you can see how that would make it quite challenging if you wanted to try and explain the impact, because row 1 and 2 might be missing out on some really key contributions to some really big ticket items. So what does this mean overall? Well, unsurprisingly, you might have picked up a theme from what we've said so far, is that it could be the case that RO impact officers may benefit from broadening the scope of their data collection. So moving away from the idea that collection is just for the local immediate needs, and actually if you can look across boundaries, you might get a more complete picture. Then there's the motherhood and apple pie recommendation, which is actually unique identifiers are good. And so we should all have more of those because that enables a lot of this tracking over time in a very light touch way. And so that's a lot of what we do across the different products. And then finally, it's really important because all of these institutions, research organizations and funders, are responding to the incentives that they're given. So people aren't making choices for particular reasons. They have actual business cases that they need to support, and that's why they're looking in a particular way. So if you're going to be judged on this particular slice, then that's what you focus on. And so it's hard if these things aren't aligned to get a true representation as to what's going on. So in terms of opportunities and tools, so there is data reuse and interoperability. And so again, this helps to understand a little bit about some of these transitions over time and how things move. And so primarily in the UK, but also in Ireland, Denmark, and Austria, and a bit across the Nordics in general, many funders use ResearchFish, and this contains some of this valuable data, and that's available to research organizations if they choose to use it. So this can give a boost to the information that they're already collecting. There is another product sort of, that you might have seen at the conference, Impact AI. And this can use the data that's collected in this way, which is all connected, to be able to do some really good and interesting work producing analyses and impact case studies based around RO and ResearchFish data. So if you haven't seen that, it's worth having a look. And Sean Newell, who is here, will be happy to talk to you about that. But that's a really interesting one, using AI, building on the TU Dublin case, for example, using that in a slightly different way. Obviously, there's the Pure portal, which James would be best placed to talk about, well, certainly between the two of us. And that helps to build institutions' narrative and showcasing. And then, as I said, finally, there's ResearchFish, which works primarily with funders, but collecting this kind of information. So there are some things that you can use there. And so in terms of what we'd like you to think about, so the first piece would be actually understanding impact means understanding the complex processes that are involved. It's like the 3 blind men and the elephant. One has the tusk, one has the tail, one has the leg. Each has their own perspective, but none of them are able individually to explain what the actual thing is. And so by pulling these things together, you can actually have this much more complete picture. The other one is, as I said, there's an incentive-based approach. And so if you have the ref in the UK that's saying you have to do these various things, then that's what you have to do. And that structure drives you to make some choices that perhaps if you were interested in the impact side of things, you might do something slightly differently, but you have to respond to these pressures. And so perhaps it would be useful to think about what those drivers are and how they can potentially be changed over time. And then finally, which is from the RO perspective, is that if you were able to leverage some of this information, that in addition to the ones that you already have, then you could actually make this bigger picture understanding about the impact that of the research in your organization is having. Because it's as all these pieces are being pulled together, that helps explain a bit more about what it is that the contributions that you've made. And so it's that looking a little bit further to be able to pull things together.